Welcome to the next installment of our AC course, Awakening the Conscience of the Christian Church. As you should know by now, we've endeavored to split the course under three general headings of a biblical burden, the hope of history, and contemporary connections. In other words, we are seeking to develop our thought in three parallel ways: from the Bible, from history, and from the present realities and situation of Jewish life in the USA. In our previous studies, we looked at the biblical burden, the first two subjects, or the first two topics, and my plan is to each month do two of each of the headings. And so I don't want to give us all the Bible first and then all the history. So rather than do that, I am endeavoring now to present a couple of papers on the hope of history. And these two papers that will be going out this month will pertain particularly to the subject of providence. In the first, we will look at things in a more general way, and then in the second, some more specifics of the history and the amazing aspects of the providence of God upon the history of the Jewish people, particularly as it pertains to the life of the Jewish people in the USA. Just generally on the subject of history, the whole subject is being increasingly blurred by a number of things. Societal ignorance could be one of them. I could blame the teachers for that. Social media imprecision. I could blame the social media companies on that, or the users. Soundbite culture. Or even worse, meme culture. For all those reasons and the situation we face in the 21st century, we have a challenge at keeping up with or understanding or knowing the truth of the record of history. No longer do we have to contend simply with the lunatic fringe of the Holocaust deniers. Instead, we have new narratives. We have very particularly, and we face it and are challenged by it in church, a godless pagan narrative that is encompassing multiple aspects of our 21st century life. Cancel culture started long before it was a hip term. For all those reasons and many, many more, it's vital that we, as we are seeking to resource the church and help you become aware of the missiological context of your gospel endeavors. In other words, the Jewish people, it's important that we help you understand the record, the narrative, the history of the Jewish people. It's important for us also to pass on a verifiable record. We need to record, retain, and proclaim some of these historical realities, the facts, so that we understand the context. And particularly so for us who are Gentiles, as we attempt to enter into the Jewish world, an appreciation of Jewish history and the amazing providences, they are a great way of making contact and making connections with our Jewish friends, even if it soon becomes apparent that they are not fully aware of their own narrative. Despite the oft-repeated adage, we can actually learn from history, from its mistakes, even its reformations. And so that's what we are going to do in our historical section of our studies. In order to understand the context of Jewish mission in the USA, it demands a number of things. It demands that we would have at least a reasonable knowledge of the history of Jewish America. It demands that we would also have a recognition of some of the misplaced philo-Semitism, love of the Jewish people, misplaced. And it demands that we would do some clarifying of the confusion that I have found both in Reformed and in dispensational theologies on the subject of Jewish mission and Israel. And therefore we present to you 6 studies under this heading. And let me just, even in this first study, iterate the 6 headings that we have. First of all, we're going to look at protective providence. Under the subheading, Jewish history declares God is. Then we're going to look at what we've termed the pirates of providence. We'll go into the detail a little bit more of Jewish history, which I've summarized again, subheading, as expulsion and expansion. I hope you're intrigued by the headings. The third that we'll look at concerns replacement and defacement. And our little subheading is forgotten and forsaken. There are bad chapters of church history that we need to admit and understand. Then I want us to look at reformational re-embracement. The Reformation changed everything for Jewish mission. And we can think not only of the time of the Reformation, but the Puritan era and the Puritan hope. Then fifthly, we're going to look at the lie of the land, and I deliberately have a play on words there. Too much love can kill you, particularly in the realm of that philo-Semitism for the land, which has no interest in the lost. And then our final study under the hope of history pertains to rewriting the rapture. What is the confusion and what needs to be corrected pertaining to our stargazing and our eschatological interest and fascination that once again loses sight of the lostness of a people? So that's the 6 that we will look at over the course of the year, but for now, we're simply going to look at the first 2 pertaining to providence. So let's begin with this first heading, protective providence. But first of all, let me illustrate. November 7th, 2017. It's insignificant to most of you. But it actually has particular significance to those of us who are involved in Christian witness to Israel, because it marked the 175th anniversary of the beginning of our missionary society. Let me turn back the pages of history. Back in May 1842, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland approved the setting up of a committee, quote, for the purposes of collecting funds and superintending such missionary operations among the Jews in London, to avail themselves as far as possible of the concurrence and cooperation of the Christians of other denominations who may be willing to give their aid to this good work of the Lord. In other words, a denomination set up a committee for Jewish mission. Go forward a few months from that, and an interdenominational body was formed with a specific first meeting, November 7th, 1842. Reverend James Hamilton of the National Scots Church in Regent Square, London, invited his good buddy down for the weekend to preach for him. But just prior to that weekend of preaching was the first meeting of this new missionary society. And so it was that the young Robert Murray McShane came to the first meeting and prayed the opening prayer, and a new society was formed, the British Society for the Propagation of the Gospel Among the Jews, later to be called Christian Witness to Israel. And now, even as of 1st of January 2021, internationally, the body is called the International Mission to Jewish People. Why do I give you that history? Because in our swiftly changing social media world of quick celebrity status and even quicker forgotten oblivion, it's important to remember history and events. It's important for us in CWI to know where we've come from and where we're going. It's important for us all to know where we've come from in the United States. It's important for us to note, consider, analyze, and learn history. You might say, well, why do I need that? I've got Google. I've got Wikipedia. Why do I need any knowledge in the random access memory of my personal brain? I find it hard and strange even to contemplate that question. But I suppose the older I get, the more I realize that this is a question for the future generation. Because when the narrative of our past is being eroded or more dangerously rewritten, we will have little grasp of the lessons that have been learned in history, and therefore little understanding, and can make little analysis of where we're going, of life's aim and purpose. This is what I want us to learn for our Jewish friends, where they have come from, where they are going, and why. Our secular world has rewritten the divine narrative with evolutionary thought that we've all come here by chance out of nothing, and the fruit of that is life is just a shadow. It's a transient dream in which we simply pursue animal desires until at the end of it all we are the object of another animal's desire, namely worms. We have a better story to tell. We have a redemption story to tell. And the sad reality also in the context of Jewish mission, most Jewish people are either agnostic or atheist. You were made for more than this. And so we want to tell them their story. But first we need to find it for ourselves. All that by way of lengthy introduction to our studies on the hope of history. But the first point I want to make under this first paper is that Jewish history declares God is. Jewish history declares God is. One of the greatest fears of the Jewish community, and we'll look at this in a subsequent study, is that they might lose their Jewishness. Jewish identity is so important, but Jewish identity is wrapped up in Jewish history, both biblical and post-biblical and historical. We should know, and I'm sure you do know, that it was always a Hebrew imperative, it was a divine imperative that the Jewish people should remember. All the Jewish festivals are visual and verbal reminders of the divine hand that brought them out of Egypt and so many other places. It's often put forward as a humorous summary to say that the Jewish festivals can be summed up in 3 sentences. They tried to kill us, God saved us, let's eat. Well, it's simple and it's fairly true. God saved them. They're still here. They rejoice in that. And indeed, it's even correct to say that the American holiday of Thanksgiving has its roots in the Jewish celebrations and festivals. Their wilderness days would be remembered in the Feast of Tabernacles. And those wilderness days would be remembered when there were better days. And so in the new world of the Americas, this thankful heart was woven into the core of life. It's sometimes been said that the greatest problem and pain for the atheist is to look around at the beauty of the earth and have no one to thank. Interestingly, in our very secular age, thanksgiving is becoming increasingly hard for those who see no divine hand of purposeful providence. And we may indeed include many Jewish people in that category of philosophical emptiness. Indeed, some will say that God died in the fires of Auschwitz, and that is a matter that we're looking at and we will look at in the future. And so, in subsequent to that, they may argue, well, they tried to kill us, but we escaped. Let's survive. That tends to be the Jewish mentality today, but we want to tell them a different narrative. And in our attempt to provide you with a resource, and I know most who are listening to this will be Gentiles, but so that you will have an understanding of Jewish history and then an intentionality to get alongside our American Jewish neighbors with the message of their Messiah, we need to know their history. And we need them to know their history. Why? Because it's divinely written. It's divinely ordered. And if it is divinely ordered, then there's a reason. There's a purpose. So as part of this course, we are stressing a biblical burden and following it up, hammering the nail in with the hope of history in order to convince our friends to study the biblical narrative of themselves, because most of them don't even know their own scriptures, and discuss with them the miraculous nature of their post-biblical history. And if they see it as miraculous, then God is. And if God is, and He's with them, then He has a purpose for them. This is where our logical conversations ought to proceed. The Jewish people are still here, not because of their own innate ability to survive. They should have been wiped out long ago, not because we're survivors, but because the hand of God has been upon them. And so in this article and in the next, I want to set before you a portrait of a people, a sovereignly guided people, a divinely cared for, a protected people, but nonetheless a lost people. We'll look at where they've come from, and then what are their aims and where they're going. And as I said, this is more the general introduction. The next study will get down to some of the specifics of their history. And as we will proceed through this, what you will discover, I trust, is that they're almost like in a corn maze where they turn this corner and that, but they're no nearer finding the way out. Or if I can change the illustration, in the words of Bono, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. And so as you consider this history, I hope you'll be as intrigued as I am at the wonder of divine providence, at the measure of divine patience. And I hope you will be as passionate as I and intentional to tell them what they're really looking for. History is stunningly significant, all of history. But of course, as we've often said, the Jewish people are just like everyone else, only more so. Well, then Jewish history is like everything else. only more so. And when we learn Jewish history in the USA, I hope this will inflame your prayers and your witness so that they will turn back to their scriptures and consider God's purpose for them. Jewish history declares God is. But also Jewish history declares God is with them. Sometimes in our Gentile narrative, we often set forth the history of the Jewish people as a history of disobedience. Oh, those stubborn rebel Jews. But truth be told, humanity is a story of disobedience from Adam onwards. We're all included with this. But what we'll find with the Jewish people is a picture of a divine hand of mercy, which we can then rejoice in even as Gentiles. The continuance of God with a disobedient people, the continuance that is rooted in His irrevocable nature and covenants and promises, which He has made and won't take back towards this peculiar people, this protected people. And His continuance with them is a lesson to the largely Gentile church that He will persevere with us sinning saints. They are loved on account of the patriarchs. And within that love is a divine protective providence. And it's been present since the Lord took the initiative and gave His grace-filled promises to them. Think of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was in a day of a different kind of Holocaust, Babylonian Holocaust. And think of Jeremiah, that weeping prophet. He was surrounded by destruction and devastation and soon dispersion. But Jeremiah nonetheless declared, Lamentations 3:21, it is of the Lord's mercies we are not consumed. Can you imagine that? He wept until he could weep no more. But he said, it is of the Lord's mercies we are not consumed. Think of a few other verses, indeed, in Lamentations of that Holocaust scene. Lamentations 1:6, they fled without strength before their pursuer. 1:11, all her people groan for food as they search for bread. They trade their treasures for food. Chapter 2:10 and 11, the elders of the daughter of Zion sit on the ground in silence. Infants and babies die in the street. This could have been written in 1940s Germany. But it's 587 BC. And Jeremiah, in the midst of that suffering, is remembering protective providence and covenantal mercy. It is of the Lord's mercies we are not consumed. Jewish history declares God is. Jewish history declares God is with them. And one of the things that we would want to share with our Jewish friends is that the imperative throughout the Bible for them to remember is so that they would remember God is and remember God is with them. In Lamentations, Jeremiah is writing Jerusalem's funeral sermon. He is declaring what she was and now what she is, and he remembers her sin. Lamentations chapters 1-4, for the Hebrew scholars among you, you will know that it is written alphabetically, poetically, and therefore it's meant to be remembered and rehearsed and learned by rote. This is not the power of positive thinking. This is the power of a pious memory. Jeremiah remembers. He remembers God. In the midst of his devastations around him and the Holocaust around him, he remembers God. He remembers his character. He remembers his loves. He remembers his mercies. He remembers the unfailing faithfulness of God to himself and to his covenants. Jesus did that also, didn't he? Oh, Jerusalem, how often have I longed to gather you. That was the power of a pious memory. And then he says, but your house is left to you desolate. The Apostle Paul did that also in those verses that we looked at in Romans 9. In effect, Paul is saying in Romans 9, those early verses, he said, look, my Jewish friends, look at what is yours. Yours is the adoption. Yours is the divine glory has been displayed among you. Yours is the covenants, the law, the temple worship, and from you the Messiah. But all of that aside, you need to be saved. One of the things that we do in our evangelism, and I trust that you too in your evangelism, is to remind our Jewish friends why they're here. Jewish history should remember. Remember God is. Remember God is with you. Remember God is with you throughout your biblical history. You should be reminded of God's protective providence. You do it at Passover. God delivered you out of Egypt. You should be reminded of these things. You read the book of Esther. You have the festival of Purim. Haman didn't win. You're still here. And Jeremiah says it is of the Lord's mercies. In a commentary by Kellogg, Studies in Leviticus, he says, the continued existence of this nation up to the present day, the preservation of its national peculiarities throughout thousands of years, in spite of all dispersion and oppression, remains so unparalleled a phenomenon that without the special providential preparation of God and his constant intervention and protection, it would be impossible to explain it. Yes, Jewish history declares God is. And Jewish people should remember God is. God is with them. God is with them in the Bible. But then post-Bible history, as we'll develop it particularly much more next time, we want our Jewish friends also to remember God is with them in America. A little taste of what's ahead will have to suffice at this point. Every schoolboy and schoolgirl will know 1607 was an important date. The first European settlement in America, Jamestown, Virginia. 1620, the Pilgrim Fathers, Plymouth, Massachusetts. What is not so well known, but I hope it will become better known, at least to you, is a much more important date. Well, two dates. 1624, there was a new settlement. It was called New Amsterdam. It would later be called New York. And in 1654, 30 years later, 23 Jewish souls sailed up the Hudson and came into harbor at New Amsterdam. 23. Today, there are 2 million Jewish people in New York City. God is with them in the United States of America. As we look at that, and as we again just kind of begin our thoughts into the next study, I want to tease a few headings under this one. I want us to think about the land of the free, the home of the brave, and then the huddled masses. And indeed, we'll develop that more later. First of all, the land of the free. In our politically correct age, with entitlements and rights being constantly heralded and lauded, it's hard for us today to imagine and understand the limited nature of Jewish rights and entitlements in the 18th century even. Everything is relative, and the Jewish community were nonetheless enjoying liberties. Restricted liberties, but liberties nonetheless. And greater liberties than they ever had experienced in Europe. However, at this time, or at that point of time, they could not live in Massachusetts, Connecticut, or New Hampshire. They just could not live there. Increasingly, though, American independence from Britain brought new laws into being, and new religious freedoms were enacted and enabled. Now, within these freedoms, though, there were challenges within a unified Jewish community, and yet it was unified and yet diverse. Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe were now living side by side with Sephardic Jews from Southern Europe. Tensions of traditions, tensions of religious observance, strained even the freedoms that they were now enjoying. And then there was the even greater challenge of living within a basically Christian Gentile society. And then there were challenges whether to separate or assimilate. And if you look down your course outline, you will discover that our first study under Contemporary Connections, we're going to look at that subject. As some of the Jewish people separated, particularly the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, whereas others assimilated, and that leads us into the more loosely observant, to the agnostic, even to the atheist. But let's get back to our little bit of history. 1791, First Amendment. Granted religious freedom. It took Thomas Jefferson to challenge the current church-state relationship. At that time, prevented Jews from owning land or having a vote. Strangely different world from the world in which we find ourselves today. So we need to try and appreciate some of the Jewish enjoyment of the freedoms, even within the remaining restrictions. And generally speaking, and again, this will be something we'll look at another time, but generally speaking, where Catholicism was more powerful, the Jewish people faced greater persecution. It wasn't until 1826 that a Jew bill was passed in Maryland, Catholic Maryland, granting the Jewish people equality. The land of the free, well, to some degree, for the Jewish people, and bit by bit. Home of the brave? They were brave. Charleston, South Carolina City Hall has a plaque outside its door to Francis Salvador, 1747 to 1776. What's so important about Francis Salvador that he has a plaque outside the City Hall in Charleston? He was the first Jewish person to hold public office and die for American independence. And it reads as follows: born an aristocrat, he became a Democrat. An Englishman, he cast his lot with America. True to his ancient faith, he gave his life for new hopes of human liberty and understanding. Francis Salvador, the home of the brave. And there was bravery also during the years of the Civil War. Now, this is where it gets complicated. 7,000 Jewish soldiers fought for the Union, and 3,000 fought for the Confederacy. Yeah, they fought on both sides. Many Southern Jewish people were in the mercantile trade, which was considered a little bit more respectable than manual labor. And so they were more accepted in Southern society than the Irish. I will not make any comment whatsoever on that question. Howard Sacker, in History of the Jews in America, he writes this: loyalty to the Confederacy often was a matter of intense personal gratitude. They loved the South. Another aspect to that was that Jewish tradition played a part in their being on both sides. They would quote Jeremiah 29:7, "Seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you," whether it was north or south. February 25th, 1861, Judah P. Benjamin was confirmed as the Attorney General of the Confederate States of America. He was to the civilian government of the South what General Lee was to the military. And indeed, some historians would suggest that Judah P. Benjamin was the brains of the Confederacy. He would later advance the radical proposal that slaves who fought for the Confederacy be freed. But by this time, the Southern nation was dissolving. So here we're gaining an understanding of the complexities of Jewish life in 19th century America. Here's another instructive anecdote. Ulysses S. Grant issued an order December 17, 1862, as follows: "The Jews as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the Department of Tennessee within 24 hours from receipt of this order." Grant would have them expelled. The Jewish people of Paducah appealed to Lincoln. Lincoln is said to have jibed, "And so the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan." Caesar Caskell of Paducah replied to Lincoln, "Yes, and that is why we have come under Father Abraham's bosom, asking protection." And Lincoln promptly replied, "And this protection you shall have." Land of the free. They fought for liberties, and they got their freedoms bit by bit. Home of the brave. There was bravery. The huddled masses. Do you know the name of Emma Lazarus? A Sephardic Jewess. She entered a poetry competition in 1883. The winning poem was to be auctioned to raise money for a pedestal that would hold a statue that had been recently donated to the United States by France. The statue was of a woman bearing a torch that would be placed in New York Harbor. Emma Lazarus won the competition, but she died aged 33 before the statue was unveiled. Her poem represents the American dream to many Jewish souls. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." America was, still is, the beautiful land of the free and the home of the brave for many Jewish people, even huddled masses. But what is not so greatly known is that the divine hand that wrote the former chapters was writing all of these chapters also, and has still some to write. And it's vital for us who have a biblical burden, as we desire to bring the gospel to Jewish people, that we also have a grasp of Jewish history, to remind our Jewish neighbors that God is with them, God is with them in the Bible, and God is with them in America. Because the reality is that Jewish history is largely forgotten. Now, we will develop this next time, but in brief, we need to say that these providences have been forgotten, either deliberately or maybe not so. But in the 21st century, Jewish communities, and there are many and they are diverse, but they have become increasingly self-made, determined to care for themselves, determined to look after themselves, determined to make the world a better place. We don't need God. In terms of their own survival and in terms of the brotherhood of man, they have largely ignored their own scriptures and their own God and even the providential narrative of their own history. You might come across your Jewish friend as being part of a Reform synagogue. Reform Judaism is majority Judaism in the USA. It's a Judaism that has adapted, particularly in the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries. And so it's adapted simply to reduce Judaism to Jewishness. And it's largely just an ethnic reality. And this is where some of my Christian friends need to have a better understanding of this, because sometimes we think of Jewish people, well, you believe this, and Christians, we believe this. Because Christianity has a lot to do with belief, and rightly so. But Judaism is largely concerned with belonging. Belief is not quite so important, at least to some. But even if you do choose to be more conservative in the Orthodox or even the ultra-Orthodox, there still needs to be some adaptation to modern life. You can buy your high-end oven with Sabbath mode. You can buy a refrigerator that disables the light and ice maker on the Sabbath. You can even buy a Shabbat pen which only has temporary ink, because according to Jewish law, an action is only prohibited if it is permanent. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of Jewishness. It's the American dream. Having faced persecution from Middle Ages Europe, through the challenges of Roman Catholicism or Russian Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and then having God die in the fires of Auschwitz, they have little left but life, liberty, and the pursuit of Jewish happiness, l'chaim. Well, let's return to Jeremiah as we draw this to a close. He faced a Holocaust, and he wept till he had no tears left. And yet he confessed, I will wait for him. That attitude of Jeremiah, that attitude of faith, waiting faith in the divine hand is almost scorned today. Jeremiah knew that as he looked on Jerusalem's horror, yet he was hopeful. Let Israel hope in the Lord, says Psalm 103. For with the Lord there is mercy, and with him is full redemption. Jewish history declares God is. God is with them. God is with them in the Bible. God is with them in the United States of America. Jewish people need to remember all of this. And then finally, our Jewish friends need to remember all of this. Know and let go. What do I mean by that? Well, we all know that little phrase, let go and let God. It can be a dangerous phrase. Be careful. We know that phrase can be misused theologically. But with the right foundational theology, you can let go and let God. And sometimes you must. In the desperation of a desolate Jerusalem, Jeremiah had to let go. He hoped in God, the God who was his portion. An old saint was once asked, what if, after a life of following and serving Christ, God were to decide to place you in hell? The believer simply answered, He can do with me as He pleases, but if He did that, He would lose more than me. In other words, God cannot act contrary to his covenanted and sworn faithfulness. He cannot be untrue to himself. Jeremiah said, I will wait. He knew his God. Paul said in Romans 11, has God completely cast off his people? Meganoite, absolutely not. And then he goes on to recount all those covenanted promises, the irrevocable promises. And we dealt with that in Romans 11. They are not consumed, Lamentations. They shall not be consumed. Jeremiah might remind himself even of his own writing in chapter 31. Let me paraphrase Jeremiah 31. When Jeremiah talks about the new covenant with the house of Israel, he also talks about the permanence of the ethnos of the Jewish people. And he says, as if, is the sun still shining? Are the moon and stars still there? Are the waves still toing and froing? Can you measure the heavens yet? Or can you see the full scope of this expanding universe? Have you completely searched the depths of the earth? Has the natural order of things turned on its head? Only if any of those things happen will the ethnos, the ethnic people, cease. Well, they're still here. Why are they not consumed? Why did 23 Jewish souls come limping up the Hudson and come into New York Harbor? Why do we have now 6 million Jewish souls here in the USA, 7 or 8 million in Israel, and another 1 to 2 around the rest of the world? Despite Haman, Herod, and Hitler, they're still here. Art Katz is a Jewish believer. He wrote a controversial book on the Holocaust entitled Where Was God? He said, if Nazi soldiers threw Jewish infants up in the air and caught them on their bayonets, I was left with 1 or 2 options. Either agree with many commentators, Jewish commentators, that God is dead, or accept the testimony of the Scriptures that God's silences are in distinct proportion to our sin. Now, this is a Jewish believer writing this. This is not a Gentile writing this. We could not write this, and we must not. But he continues optimistically, we, Jewish people, will yet be that blessing to all the families of the earth. Not in the arrogance and self-sufficiency that has characterized us till now, but in a brokenness and humility that is yet to come in our final latter-day dealings with God. Wow. We can't understand the reason for the divine permission of 587 BC, Babylon invading and destroying. We can't understand the reason for the divine permission of the horrors of the Crusades, or the Inquisition, or the pogroms, or the Holocaust. We better just bow our heads, but we can be reassured it is of the Lord's mercies. They are not consumed. I believe Art Katz is right. There are yet final latter-day dealings between God and the Jewish people. The protective providence, God is with them in the United States. Why? As we see the biblical burden, as we grow in our understanding of the hope of history, then we're going to look at how do we make those connections for the gospel in 21st century Jewish America. May God bless us all in our task. Let's bow in prayer. Father, history is truly your story. We pray that you would help us to understand it, And help us then to see purpose and put into practice the things that you are teaching us. Give us afresh an intentionality to tell our Jewish friends that you are here, you are with them, you have been with them, and you have yet unfulfilled business. And it concerns Jesus. So help us to speak a word in season for Christ's sake. Amen.